So today we're particularly going to be exploring consciousness from the what and the why and the how and even the who or what might be experiencing it. Welcome, Jakob. It's a real pleasure to have you as our guest today.
Thank you. Thanks, Craig.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'd like to find out a little bit about, I'm sure our viewers today would as well. You had an interest in philosophy, an interest in reading Plato, like in your early adolescence, you're reading Platonic dialogues and so on. That's not your average reading for somebody in that sort of age category. So what really drew you to this love of philosophy right from early days?
That's a very good question. Who knows what happens in our childhoods and so on. I remember reading, just picking up maybe by random in the local library, a book on with about Socrates and how he had to drink the hemlock for corrupting the youth and so on. And I always felt that it was an incredible injustice. Why was it? Clearly corrupting the youth was a good thing, and drinking hemlock for that reason was a bit of an uh, an unfair thing to happen to Socrates. And that led to other kinds of maybe slightly quirky, idiosyncratic things for me as a child and into adolescence. So maybe it's genetic. I don't know. I like to sit back and observe things and think about them. Maybe it's because the world is perplexing to me half the time. And so being a philosopher is one way of trying to deal with perplexity, I guess.
Yeah. Well, to be perplexed and to be happy to be perplexed and to engage with it is something that I suspect most of the time most of us would shy away from. So, so you developed this interest in philosophy, but you didn't just it wasn't a passing interest. Obviously, your career path, your studies and career path took you in that direction. So, but from there to an interest in consciousness science. So what was some of the breadcrumbs dropped along the way that led you from philosophy to consciousness science?
Mhm. A lot of it is this perplexity, I think, and also some serendipity. At one point, I shared an office with a great philosopher who's doing research into the philosophy of psychiatry. My own dad was a psychiatrist, so there's a bit of kind of inherent interest, and that kind of brought me into a more empirical frame of mind for doing some philosophical research and thinking about how it matters for diverse consciousnesses and so on. And then, consciousness is just one of these big mysteries in the world. And as a young person, you're, drawn to big mysteries, and you get a sense of the challenges in addressing this and the big philosophical wisdom tradition around these questions, and that just has kept fascinating me up through my undergraduate years, as I did my PhD, and then as I embarked on my career, it became more and more the focus of what I did.
Was it purely just the theoretical interest in it, or were you really wanting to understand yourself better? Because many people pursue contemplative practices or consciousness science, psychology, wanting to understand ourselves better. Was it a personal thing or just purely you're interested in the concepts?
No, it's a very good question. So when you're a young man, early 20s, I think, well, at least for me, at least, there was not a huge impetus about knowing myself or changing myself. It was all about the excitement of the big questions back then. And this, it has only been in this much later journey with you and the center that the very intimate connection between the study of consciousness and then what happens within myself. It's become a really kind of prominent feature, and so it's an interesting kind of almost reversing myself into contemplative studies and finding myself there, and all of a sudden learning about some of the deep connections that actually motivated a lot of the people who've gone before in the history of philosophy and contemplative studies, which I just ignored just to focus on the academic questions and so on. So it's a very good question what that journey actually is for everyone who works in this kind of field.
Yeah, there's no one path, I'm sure. Everybody comes to things one's own way. Now, I've been using terms like consciousness and consciousness science and so on. So I think probably we should get back to basics to help myself and everybody else understand. So exactly what is consciousness in the way that most consciousness scientists would think of it, and what is consciousness science? How do you actually investigate it?
The great jazz musician Louis Armstrong was one to ask, "What is jazz?" And his answer was, "Man, if you have to ask, then you will never know." And consciousness is a little bit the same. It's something that is actually almost impossible to define the way we can define pretty much everything else that we think about. Yet it's something that each one of us actually know very intimately. It's the thing that kicks on in the morning when we wake up after a dreamless sleep. Maybe it's a nice Sunday morning. You've opened the windows, you can hear the birds. The windows the curtains are fluttering. There's maybe a smell of coffee somewhere. All these things start populating your consciousness. You become conscious of things. And through the day, each one of us have our own conscious journey with our own experiences. And we assume that other people have these as well, but strictly we don't really know because you can only observe your own consciousness. This is part of the problem. There's an inherent subjectivity to conscious experience. Not only is it only known by you as consciousness, I can tell in words about my consciousness to other people, but they don't really know it in the way I do. And each experience is imbued with this intangible sense of subjectivity of this is my experience. This is not just seen sort of geometrically from my perspective, but it has a sense of self woven into it as well. And that's the starting point for the mystery. We all know it. We can kind of communicate about it. It's very private. It's subjective as well. It has this kind of first-person perspective in a really deep sense connected to ourselves and our identity and who we are and so on. And that's where it all starts because it's so hard to actually define. And normally when we want to embark on some kind of scientific domain about, in biology or economics or whatever it might be, we define the phenomena that we want to investigate. We say, this is what it is. And we can do that in some of the sciences of the mind. So memory is the retention of memory, and it can be episodic memory, or it can be semantic memory, and so on. We can define these kinds of things. But for consciousness, it's more like we say, "Oh, but you know what it is, don't you? It's the thing, when you open your eyes and you have these things flooding through your mind, and it's there's redness, there's pain, there's emotion, all those kinds of things. And then you say, yeah, I kind of know what you mean." And so how can we study that scientifically? That has really been the challenge for science. You might say, why do we need to study it scientifically as well?
Jakob, why do we need to study it as well?
Yeah,
I
thanks,
thought I should
thanks for
say.
asking. Well, consciousness is important for a lot of mental health problems. So psychosis, schizophrenia, depression, all have and maybe even start with disturbances in consciousness. Something happens that is out of the ordinary for the rest of us, in terms of the way all of a sudden reality is distorted. Our subjective experience of reality and our subjective experience of ourselves begins to kind of have some elements that maybe lead us down the path of some kind of suffering. In depression, we might have some emotional things going on, which are happening in consciousness. They're not unconscious changes, though there might also be unconscious changes. Then there are disorders of consciousness, which is a huge problem, which is when people have car accidents or brain clots or whatever it might be. Something happens that changes their consciousness. They might be in a coma or a vegetative state or one of the other kind of states that have some kind of changed consciousness. And we don't know what it's like to be in that state. And we don't know how to help patients like that. And there's a lot of worry now in neurology and medicine about what do we do with patients where we don't really know how to even ask the question of how conscious they are. But I think also we have to ask the question, what is the place of consciousness in nature? Everything else has a kind of place in nature. our activities, our buildings, our everything we do has a place in nature. How does consciousness fit into nature? How can we understand ourselves and the thing that is most important to us, namely our consciousness? How can we understand that as arising from brain activity, arising in interaction with other people, and so on? So for me, it's an incredibly important question to ask. And how we ask it then, which might be your next question. I don't know what your next question is.
I'm happy to ask that question if you'd like to answer it.
No, it's for many years, consciousness was a no-go area in serious science because it has this subjective sense where you actually have to ask the person you're studying, what is it you're experiencing consciously right now? You have to trust the person you're studying to give a correct report of their conscious experience. And that's unlike studying something in physics or biology or chemistry, where we can measure things objectively. Here we have to trust the subject. So for many years, it was viewed as too hard, not really serious science. And then methods began to emerge where we could kind of isolate changes in consciousness and look at the underlying brain activity at the same time. And that has really been a very fruitful research program, finding the neural correlates in the brain of changes in conscious experience that we have. And that has shown up some areas of the brain that are more involved in consciousness than others. And it's been very interesting, but we still don't know exactly what the brain basis of consciousness is. There's a very long way to go. There's a lot of different theories that then try to look at these neural correlates and figure out some theoretical grounding for how consciousness arises. But we're not there. There's a long way to go. And this is where philosophy comes in, because philosophy has known for a long time that this is actually a very hard problem because of this inherent subjectivity. Because you can pretty much imagine any kind of brain activity, some neurons firing in a certain pattern that correlates with our being conscious. But actually, when you look at it on its own, you can't understand why that would give rise to consciousness, to our subjective experience. You can just easily imagine that those neurons fire and they're not conscious. And so that is really the kind of difficult mind-body problem that philosophers have been talking about for thousands of years, which is now kind of really coming in as a very active player in the science of consciousness. How can we kind of arbitrate between those deep philosophical problems, the mind-body problem, and then on the other hand, the scientific endeavor to really find out what the brain basis of consciousness is?
Just what was coming to mind was a question around, well, what is the subconscious? It's not an uncommon thing. Say somebody's exploring the use of mindfulness to help them manage anxiety, and when a person starts to practice mindfulness, that having feelings of anxiety in the body, the activation of the fight or flight that's going on, and why, don't know, just have this feeling. And when they start to learn mindfulness, and so they're cultivating attention and awareness, very often start to become much more aware of things they were not conscious of, which were obviously there, like worry and rumination and projecting into a future and what if and maybe and reliving things from the past. So this whole area becomes more aware to them. So where is this subconscious in consciousness science? Is that just something that's sitting there that's not able to be observed? Or does it not exist if you're not aware of it?
No, it's a great question. And it's something that both philosophers and neuroscientists and psychologists and contemplative studies researchers really think hard about, I think. So science often works by way of contrasting conditions. And one important condition, of course, for consciousness science is to contrast something that is unconscious, but still in the head somehow, with something that is conscious. So a lot of the typical experiments that we run have various kinds of visual input where clever techniques allow us to make some of the visual input unconscious, still processed up to some level, but not populating your consciousness. And another part of the sensory input to the eye, say, it pops into consciousness. And then we can look in the brain and see, okay, what is that tipping point between taking something that is hitting the eyes, being processed through the visual cortex and is somewhat coming up through the brain. What is it that takes that and either makes it unconscious or conscious? And so that contrast is very important. But what you're asking also harks back to, for instance, issues about kind of the Freudian unconscious. Do we have like a bigger stories, bigger things that are happening under the conscious radar, as it were, and what role do they play for our health and our well-being and so on? And we are very interested in that. A big player here in consciousness science is the role of attention. Right? So the way that attention interacts with consciousness. So we can attend to things. So when you are sitting in a Zoom meeting or something like that, your attention can be captured by some loud noise that happens in the background. So all of a sudden your attention goes somewhere else, or I can focus my attention on something through my own volition. And so attention is a huge area in cognitive neuroscience to study, in psychology to study. It has a huge influence on mental health and so on, but it interacts with consciousness in a really interesting way. So attention can pull something up from the unconscious, make it conscious. And that's the kind of situation you mentioned, for instance, when through some kind of mental action, a conscious mental action, maybe that we are training as part of a mindfulness course, we become able to attend to something that was always there and had a role to play in our mental economy, but which was under the conscious radar. We can pull it into consciousness through attention. And we are working on various computational models of how the brain works that can really describe that mechanism of taking something that is kind of vague and under the radar and amplifying it. And what happens is there's some kind of threat. And it has been a little bit constricted in a sense. It has been constricted to, are you seeing this square on the screen or this triangle on the screen, things like that. And I think part of the journey that you and I and the center have been on is trying to expand this idea into things that actually matter more than squares and triangles. So they can be quite important as well, but such as, the narrative that I have about myself, or what we sometimes call meta-awareness, like my awareness of where my awareness is. Can I actually, through mental action, begin to look into myself and say, oh, my attention went over there when it should have been there. Let me try and see whether I can get it back in. Those kinds of sort of an active, aware engagement with our own consciousness is becoming really important in the way I see consciousness science. Whereas a lot of consciousness science elsewhere is more focused on kind of basic perceptual consciousness, what we hear, what we see, and so on.
The mental health implications are significant, not just for anxiety, but for depression, etc., of cultivating this awareness of where the attention's going. And because you're interested in decision making and rationality as well. So developing more informed decisions about what to give attention to. So like a really negative internal narrative running the whole time, being able to unhook the attention from that and re-engage the attention with things in our lives that we're really interested in, passionate about, etc. So can we develop, from a consciousness science perspective, more choice, more autonomy over what we give our attention to or not? Because it seems like that's really what gets powered in many ways in the mind.
Yeah, no, I like that. So the way I like to think about that kind of question is that it's like humans in particular, maybe also several animals, have kind of superpowers, right? We can go offline. We can go into some kind of counterfactual space, mental time travel, where we can think about what should I do in the what should I do in the future? Or what will I come to experience if I act in these ways? Or I don't want to experience that. What will I instead experience in the future if I act in these ways? Oh, this is more aligned with where I expect myself to be in the future. And we can go offline and we can explore, we can explore that with great depth. This is probably where creativity and fiction and so on begins as well, because we can write out some of these counterfactual stories, of course. And they mean so much for our capacity for engaging flexibly with changing environments and so on. But they also come with a downside, because if I stay in that rumination kind of pattern and I don't really know, that I don't have any options, I don't have any good ideas for what I can do, then that can be bad for mental health. Then we have another superpower, which is that we can take very complex patterns of behavior and decision making and make them into mental habits, which is fantastic. Then they kind of sink down below consciousness, and they're just the things we do. So I think a lot of us will have the experience of taking the really complicated thing of driving a car to work. And actually, after doing that for a couple of years, we can do it almost unconsciously and think about all sorts of wonderful things while the habits have taken over. And so if someone were to ask you, did you notice that fancy car at the intersection halfway to work? We have got no idea. Our consciousness didn't register what happened. And instead we are in our own heads. And yet we arrive safely at work. So we can turn things into habits, but that also comes with a downside, right? Because habits are then things that we don't really think about. So on the one hand, and then we can end up in patterns where we keep perpetuating a certain habit, but now the world has changed. Traffic has increased, or there's roadworks or whatever it is, for that example, where all of a sudden the habit is no longer fit for purpose. And what do we do then? We have to attend back. We have to lift it out into consciousness, think about our goals again, take a more active approach to our own habits. And that can be very hard because habits are really convenient to have. So we have these two superpowers. We go a lot into the counterfactual space of imagination and projecting into the future and remembering the past and so on. And at the same time, we also have this urge to turn everything into habits. Both are super helpful, but they also have downsides. And I think that cultivating, in the way that you mentioned, this ability to be more in control of how we attend to our habits, how we attend to our mental time travel and our counterfactual flights of fancy and so on, and what happens when we are in those modes, can be really, really helpful for mental health. But it's important, for me, it's important to kind of see both sides of that coin.
Yeah. We're going to get to the hard problem of consciousness in a moment, because I'd like to solve that before the seminar finishes today.
You.
So just before we do, though, because you were talking before a little bit about your own journey, and you came at it from a theoretical interest, to solve the intellectual challenge, to solve big questions around consciousness. But you later on came to contemplative practices yourself. So has your experience of practicing meditative exercises and so on changed or nuanced, or your understanding or approach to consciousness and consciousness science?
Yes, in many ways, in two main ways, I think. So one is just, as often happens when you go through a research career as an academic, that all of a sudden you come across an area of research and study that you weren't really aware of, and you weren't aware of the depth and the quality of the research and the insights from this domain. You come across it and you go, oh, and then you almost like you get distracted by it, but in a good way. And when that happens, it's really wonderful. So I started out as a philosopher, then I came across psychiatry, then neuroscience, then computational modeling, theoretical neurobiology, and so on. And contemplative studies is just I have discovered is a really wonderful and rich and important area to connect to the stuff that I already do. And so just hearing yourself, my students, and others talk about their contemplative practices, it's just opened this kind of cornucopia of ideas and insights and so on. And then in my own contemplative practice, which is really fledgling and an interesting journey that I've just kind of launched myself into just to discover, it's been so interesting. I think being able to, for me, it's being able to observe this instrument that we have, which is attention, and how when I sit and meditate, it's like fireworks going off in my head with my attention is just storming around all over the place, which is not something I had noticed. Right. And now I'm noticing it and I'm having a lot of fun with it. I'm not kind of getting frustrated with it. It's just really, really interesting to see how it goes and then what reacts when I try to engage in awareness and meta-awareness and in mental action around my attention and what happens. And here, these wider aspects, I think, of contemplative practice around compassion and around self-compassion, which I would not have predicted was really central to a scientific understanding of the mind and consciousness, they actually come in as something incredibly important as well. And really central to our understanding of not just contemplative practice, but of consciousness itself. And so for me, that has been a really interesting journey that has led also to research projects on what is the relation between meditation and contemplation and actually being a moral person. In what ways do you become better, worse, or doesn't it have an effect on your moral being? So those are the kinds of questions that have really been important, I think, in this.
Yeah, I dare say for thousands of years, there may not have been labs like we've got at M3CS, etc., but the lab was this sort of internal awareness that was cultivated through these practices and to observe, broadly what's going on around one. So the contemplatives have had their lab, as it were, for a long time. I was just interested too about this predictive processing as well. And so you have written pretty much a classic or a foundational text in the field called the predictive mind. And so what is the predictive mind? What is predictive processing?
Yeah, so it's a framework for understanding the brain and for understanding, it's a theoretical framework for understanding perception and memory and decision making and learning and understanding the kind of flow of conscious experience during the day, understanding illusions, understanding the self. So it's a very powerful theoretical framework that essentially just says the world is a weird place. It throws all these sensory inputs at our sensory organs, our eyes, our ears, our sense of touch, and so on. And somehow the brain has to make sense of all this sensory input. And one thing that's useful for making sense of things is to figure out, well, what stuff out in the world was the cause of that sensory input. And causes out in the world of our sensory input can have many different layers. So I'm looking at you right now. I can see your face. I can see your shirt. That's the visual input I get. And so I'm trying to make sense of what you say from the way your mouth moves and so on. But I'm also trying to make sense of what's in your head, your mental states, your beliefs, what was behind that question, and so on. So I'm diving deeper and deeper in. So my attempt to make sense of the sensory input that comes from you requires me to have this kind of model of everything that happens out in the world, of other people moving around, what's in other people's heads, what this structure is, the context that we're in, university in this case, what happens in the world, those kinds of things. All those things influence how things hit my senses and so on. And then I use that model to predict what's going to come next. Right? So I say, well, I think I know what Craig is going to ask next. And then I make some
I
predictions.
can assure you don't.
And then I make some predictions about that. And then if you do say exactly what I predicted, then I have confirmed my model. Right? I have provided evidence for my own model of the world, and that's good because now I'm in control of what's happening around me and so on. And if there's a divergence, if you say something unexpected, for instance, then that creates what we call a prediction error. I made a prediction and it wasn't a good prediction because you surprised me, as you often do. And then I can use that signal, the prediction error, as a learning signal for my model. I can update my model and say, Craig has an interest in graphic novels as well, right? If that was the question that all of a sudden came, which I wouldn't have predicted. So prediction errors are really important learning signals for this big model of what is happening in the world that impacts on me, which includes other people, communities, and so on. And then I can use all of that, and this is really where this field of research is going. I can use all of this to then look into the future. I can say, if this is the model of the world, where that model includes, importantly, a model of myself, I can say, well, what will I expect to experience in the future? Well, I would like some ice cream. I would like to win my next grant, let's say. I would like success for the center. I would like world peace. These are the things I would like to observe in the future. And then I can make decisions and make plans that will make that future come about with as little prediction error as possible. So even in my decision making, there's this mechanism of just trying to have as little prediction error as possible. So prediction error can both be a signal that allows me to update my model and learn, but prediction error can also be a thing that I just want to keep as little as possible so that the world conforms to my desires. And all of this can be described in mathematically in computational models that allow us to unpack why people act in the way they do, why I act in the way I do, why my experience evolves over time in the way that it does over minutes or seconds or hours or through my lifetime. What is it that happens in my consciousness? Because the idea is the thing that I predict the best is what I consciously experience as well. So everything hangs together in this nice framework, which a lot of people around the world are trying to develop, both by experimental testing and by expanding it into contemplative practices of various sorts, and by modeling things computationally as well.
It sounds like it's a bit of a two-edged sword, in the sense that we, predicted we can get entrenched in ways of thinking and doing things and making assumptions that maybe and not recalibrating. It's I said we'd explore a little bit about the hard problem of consciousness. And Richard Chalmers, an Australian philosopher who spent a lot of time working overseas, but in a kind of a nutshell, the problem of explaining the relationship between physical phenomena such as brain processes and experience. Why are physical processes ever accompanied by experience? And why does a given physical process generate the specific experience it does? So this sort of sense of trying to explain consciousness by physical activity in the brain. And just to contrast that, and I'd be interested in your thoughts, Erwin Schrödinger was actually a Nobel Prize winning physicist, and very interested in various wisdom traditions. And quote from him, consciousness cannot be accounted for in physical terms, for consciousness is absolutely fundamental. It cannot be accounted for in terms of anything else. So how can a consciousness scientist even investigate or try and resolve that thing about physical? I suppose in a material sort of science, physical is the foundation of reality and consciousness comes from that, whereas to a lot of those wisdom traditions, the consciousness is foundational and everything arises from that. How could you even try and test that about which is the right model?
Yeah. It's part of what makes consciousness science such a fascinating field is it has that, as I said, combination of the kind of philosophical reflection and philosophical problems that are pretty much perennial, and then these kind of cutting edge techniques in neuroscience and ambitions and aspirations of science to naturalize phenomena that comes up against views like Schrödinger's about the irreducibility, essentially. of consciousness. I think I want to start by saying that philosophy, the main kind of teaching that comes out of philosophy is that it is very hard to rest with any position on consciousness, but also on other kinds of debates about justice and beauty and truth and so on, that none of the ideas that we have about these core concepts for humanity, none of the ideas that we have allow us to actually rest comfortably and just say, well, that is where we want to be. There are no open questions. There are no so philosophy is concerned with that kind of intellectual restlessness, which we don't see in other kinds of domains of science, for instance. So in oncology and cancer research, for instance, if we look at a tumor and we know what properties govern the division of the cells in this tumor, we can say, well, this is a cancer. There are no open questions here. There's lots of research questions about how to treat it and what caused it and so on, but there's no open question about whether this is a cancer or not, typically. Same for memory, for instance. Unconscious memory is something that probably can be described in terms of the way that neurons change over time and can store patterns of activity and so on. There's no real open question when you then look at a neural network of some sort and say, well, it has memory. Yes, it does have, because it changes in this way as a result of this input and so on. The problem with consciousness is that it leaves open questions. So we look at some kind of neural activity, maybe in the brainstem, maybe in the interaction between the brainstem and the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. We look at that activity. Maybe we look at specific types of neurons firing in particular ways in the cortex and so on. We look at it and say, well, that's associated with consciousness, but it's an open question whether a system that has exactly those properties of firing in this way and being connected in this way, whether it's conscious or not. And so that open question is the mark of a deep philosophical problem. And that is the hard problem. It's that openness of that question that does not arise in other scientific fields. And consciousness science is pretty much alone in having that very clear, open question. And then you'll find people who have different kinds of opinions about how should we react to this. There's an open question, and one way is to go Schrödinger's way. So remember, he was not a consciousness scientist; he was a physicist. So maybe not an expert on the topic, but his position is not unusual by saying, well, given that I can't really imagine that brain science would ever be able to close that question and just make it as it were, a no-brainer that yes, consciousness must necessarily arise when you have this kind of activity. Given that it's hard to see or even imagine neuroscience or any kind of science closing that gap, maybe consciousness is fundamental. Like that would be a solution. We write consciousness into the fundamental fabric of the universe. Fine. But you can't rest there either intellectually or scientifically because, okay, but what does that mean? Does it mean that every basic particle in the universe has this companion of a bit of consciousness that when they get put together in the right way in a human brain, that they give us the consciousness? Do we want to say that every neuron or every atom in the world is conscious in some way? This view is called panpsychism. There are a few people who are kind of enticed by this view, and they're not stupid people at all. But it's hard to make sense of that view. It's hard to then build up from fundamental conscious particles, whatever that is, to the consciousness that we know and love with the coffee and the waking up and all that stuff. And there's also a problem there about sometimes we know that our consciousness makes us do something in the world, makes us act in certain ways. I have a craving for ice cream. I eat the ice cream, but it was a Vegemite ice cream. I did not thought it was chocolate. And so my conscious experiences of disgust, I spit it out. Right? My conscious experience just, didn't, cause me to do something. So now we have causation between something conscious and something physical, my spitting out the ice cream. But how can we allow that in the universe, which is governed by laws of physics? Where does this extra force come from? So there's lots of problems for every response that we have to the hard problem of consciousness. Should we build it in at the foundation? That's really hard. Should we say that it arises in brain activity? That's really hard as well. Should we say that there's no consciousness at all? It's kind of an illusion that we have consciousness? No, because it's not an illusion, right? And the open question that drives that hard problem is not an illusion either.
Right. And there are so many related questions we won't have time for today, about AI, can that become conscious, etc. I know there's a lot of debate about that. Now, we're going to take questions from participants very shortly, but I just wanted to come to some really big questions, some important ones, and hoping you can make sense of it. Now, there are a lot of interesting Danish sayings, and your Danish, of course, with quite a raw flavour. Just very briefly, can you please explain what the following sayings mean? Pat the horse.
To pat the horse, it means to take a chill pill. Like, because if you go up to a horse and you try to pet it and you're kind of all agitated and so on, then it's not going to go well. So pat the horse is just calm down. Just stand there, just pat the horse.
There's no cow on the ice.
There's no cow on the ice. That means there's no problem here, right? No problem. And the idea is very simple, that if the cow had been out on the ice, that would be a problem because it might go through the ice. So you don't want any cows on the ice. And if there are no cows on the ice, there's no problem.
The raisin in the end of the sausage.
The raisin at the end of the sausage is when a good thing happens at the end of a long day, for instance. You literally get a cake at the end, or there's a surprise at the end. So there's a long sausage, it's very boring and so on. By the end, there's a little sweetener.
Very good. Well, thank you for explaining that. Now we feel much more informed. And your Danish love of ice cream, but detestation of Vegemite is probably genetic, I suspect. I'll hand back to Jess now, and I think there might be a few questions that I'd like to put in the time that we have.
Yes, just a few. It's quite a lot. So I'm going to do my best to get through what's come in. So this one I think is for you, Jakob. Do you view consciousness as a state of being?
As a state of being. Is consciousness a state of being? That is a very good question. And in the past, I would have said, no, it's just the property of who you are. It's the property of what happens to you during the day. But both with my journey into contemplative studies and also based on these big theoretical frameworks around computational modeling and so on, there's an increasing kind of move into thinking about the existence of a creature like one of us, or any kind of organic creature, and then some kind of sentience or some kind of computational functioning that, in a sense, underpins what happens in consciousness. So I'm prepared to begin to move into that. So for me, it's a very good question, actually.
Have Hindu non-duality views consciousness as the true subject, separate from objects like thoughts and perceptions, while consciousness science often includes these objects within consciousness itself. How do you see the distinction?
I don't know if you want to speak to that, Craig.
No, you're the guy.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And so consciousness science for a long time has been very preoccupied with very simple things because they are easier in a sense to study. So the sensation of seeing something red, or getting a little bit of pain on your thumb, or seeing a red square, or smelling a rose, or something like that. And it's been quite austere. And so there has been a tendency to try and build in other aspects of consciousness around the self and so on. And I don't think that the scientific field has a very good understanding or incorporation of insights from the wisdom traditions around where does the self sit in relation to consciousness, and can you have one without the other? There's some great work done here. Our great colleague, Monash Centre, for instance, who's unfortunately just moved to become a professor at Oxford University, has some great work on exactly this idea of the relation between conscious experience and self and no self. That comes out of various traditions in Buddhist philosophy and so on. And I'm not an expert on it, but I can certainly see this kind of development happening where where people are becoming more and more interested in asking whether we can model consciousness and take the self out of the equation, because that seems to be what's happening in some contemplative states.
Great. This is also incorporating other researchers in our centres, but we could try and address this one. Where do dreams fit into the picture? We are conscious of them, and at times can seem to control them, but they can also leave us with strong, unpleasant emotions, which we do not want to experience.
Yeah, so Jennifer Vinton is one of the world's leading experts on dreams. So really, I wish that she was here to answer that question. But dreams are incredibly important. They tell us something very interesting about consciousness, namely that you can be conscious even though you are shut off from the external world. You can have rich, booming, blossoming conscious experiences while you're sleeping, while you're not actually receiving anything through the senses. And so there's lots of questions about, how are you involved in that? Are they good for us? Are they bad for us? What happens when you're in the relation between mental health and dreaming and so on? And some theories of consciousness actually start from dreaming as well and say we must be able to explain the brain basis of consciousness just on the basis of what happens within the brain without sensory input. And it's a very important insight. For me, dreaming is something incredibly boring in a sense. Dreaming is the brain's attempt to take the model of the world that we talked about before, which has been built up during the previous day, look at it and go, it's a bit messy, it's a bit complex. I've added too many different parts to my internal model. Let me simplify it by kind of running some test runs and see what I can get rid of. And dreaming is the subjective, conscious expression of that computational cleansing process. So that's the story that I would tell and that other people are telling as well about the computational underpinnings and function of dreaming is a decomplexification process for our internal model, so that when we wake up the next morning, we're ready to learn again, but without an overly cluttered model of the world. And that is why when you then have sleep problems, you don't clean up your model. You wake up and your model is still not really as good as it could be.
Well, I'm just a little bit conscious of time, and I'm about to quote some Shakespeare here. Our revels now are ended, and our actors, as I foretold you, are all spirits and are about to melt into thin air. So it's about time for us to finish for today, Jakob. It's been fascinating. Look, I feel like we've hardly even scratched the surface, so expect a knock on the door next year to come back and we'll have a part B of this. But I just wanted to thank you, and I want to thank Jess as well for doing all the work behind the scenes to really get this seminar series going. I hope everybody who's been our viewers today and throughout the year has really, really enjoyed it. And we'll look forward to seeing everybody again next year.
Thanks. Pleasure, Craig.
Thanks, Jakob. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, everyone.